Russian forces managed to make several advances on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, gaining control over the remaining parts of Zatyshok and continuing westwards in the northern flank of Donetsk. Additional push towards Sofiivka in the northeast, a push through the apartment complex area in the central parts of Menurak, and in advance in the western flank of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the western flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians gain control over an additional first line, where the Russians are slowly pushing through the defenses of the Ukrainians along the forest lines, pushing up in the northern direction towards the E50 highway and the railway line, and the eastern flank of the coal mine in general. The Russians are here developing offensive operations towards Sofiivka and the southern flank of Reservoir. Within Menurak, the Russians continue offensive operations within the apartment complex area, gaining control over school number 6 and the eastern parts of the apartment complex area, connecting to the northern section of the city and pushing the Ukrainians to the western outskirts of these apartment buildings. This means the Russians are very close to getting full control of it, because the Ukrainian forces withdrawing to the western parts, withdrawing from the exit into the main parts of the city, would be few soldiers, mainly already centered around the area, as ones centered around the northern parts would be withdrawing into the northern residential area. That means the remaining Ukrainian soldiers within the apartment complex area is minimal, and the Russians will look to gain full control of it to then conduct their offensive operations further north towards the main parts of the city, where there is additional apartment complex buildings here in the southern parts. There's a school area, apartment complex area overlooking the southern residential area. That means it is really difficult for the Russians to push through from the southern direction. They'll likely launch a lot of FAB bombs on those positions and then push through the residential areas and push through the apartment complex area in the eastern flank, where the Ukrainians do not have a proper cover. From that direction, there's the garage area, and then there's the eastern apartment complex buildings. But from the northern flank, there is nothing that covers the supply lines into the apartment complex buildings, nor the apartment complex buildings further north. The Russians can simply bypass these positions and attack from the rear. Not to mention a push by the Russian forces from the railway line from the western flank to push into the rear of the apartment complex area from that direction. There's the industrial area in the central parts of the city along the railway line, and then there are additional apartment complex buildings along the main road leading down to the southern direction. That means there's a lot of areas remaining within Menurak where the Ukrainian forces are concentrated within for the defense of the city and hold out for as long as possible. But the Russians continue their small advances, where they're looking to gain full control over the city at their own pace, where they're able to take as few casualties as possible. Since the encirclement has already been closed, no Ukrainian soldiers will be getting out of the encirclement, so there is no hurry for the Russian forces to eliminate the pocket. Instead, they'll be focusing on keeping their soldiers alive while redirecting their forces in the northern direction towards the northern flank of Pokrovsk in the direction of Reservoir, the fortifications, Donetsk, and then onwards and beyond. As we see with the push from Zatyshok, where the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of the town, the northern flank along the forest lines, the forest lines to the northwest, as well as the dash area east of Sofiivka, and then a push towards the railway line, where they've managed to gain control over it and breach through the defensive line, where crossings had already been made for the Ukrainian forces to resupply the forces operating within Zatyshok and the Dacha area. From this, the Russians can push through towards Bilitzk, which is the next city in a line for the next defensive lines. From this, we can see that the Russians are ending the battle near Donetsk, from which they will look to push up north towards Bilitzk, and with a combined push from the southeast, south, and northeast, the Russians will be able to push into the city from 3 different directions. And I call it a city because the pre-war population of Bilitzk was over 10,000 people. There are several apartment complex buildings similar to Donetsk, and it is a similar sized city to Donetsk. Bilitzk is fairly isolated as a city. There is no close settlements next to it. The Russians would have to push through open fields no matter which direction they are pushing from. There's of course the forest lines. However, it is the month of November, which means that the leaves have fallen from the trees and the trees do not provide that much cover any longer. That means a push into Bilitzk is difficult, but once the Russians gain a foothold, it will be similar to Donetsk and other sectors of the front line, where the Russians are able to win in these urban battles. The capture of Bilitzk will give the Russians a significant advantage for a further push towards Dobropolya, as it will allow the Russians to bypass the defensive lines near Shevchenko, Svitle, Vodiansk, and Cherniivka here to the west of Bilitzk, and open the road for a push towards Dobropolya directly from the Dorozhne direction. If we take a look at the fortifications map, we can see that if the Russians gain control over Bilitzk, then the fortifications to the north of it in the direction of Dorozhne will be outflanked by the Russian forces from within the city. Again, that will open the road towards Dobropolya with just a single fortified position overlooking the defense of the city from the east. There's the defensive line east of the city, which Russians can bypass. It is not well layered like the ones to the south. In conclusion, a Russian push to gain control over Bilitzk will be a game changer for the forces operating further north towards Dobropolya. As for the push from Rodinsk, we can see that there is this defensive line and several fortifications in between Rodinsk and Bilitzk. This is why the push from Zatyshok is so significant, because it bypasses the rear of these defensive lines, allowing the Russians to create a pass through the main highway once they capture Rodinsk in the northern direction. So from this we can see that the Russians have a significant advantage from the capture of Zatyshok and the push in the western direction, bypassing Sofiivka and then pushing into the rear of the defensive lines for a push from the south, southeast, and northeast towards Bilitzk. To the northeast of this, the Russians managed to gain a foothold within the southern and northeastern outskirts of Sofiivka, gaining a foothold within the first 3 streets of Sofiivka in the southern portion of the town and the farm area in the northeastern flank of it. The Russians are here pushing from the eastern flank to cut off the supply routes into the town, and with the capture of the southern parts, they also captured the crossing between Sofiivka and Donetsk along the Kaseny-Turets river line. This means the Russians are now pushing through to gain full control over the town from the eastern and southern flanks. Gaining control over Sofiivka will open the road for Donetsk further northwest and connect their forces from Sharova in the south towards Sofiivka and Donetsk in the north. Also allowed Russians to flank the quarries and defensive lines of the Ukrainians here southeast of Reservoir for a push in the northern direction, continuing offensive operations beyond the Kaseny-Turets river line and the northeastern flank of Pokrovsk and Menurak. The Russian objective in this section of the front line is to push up towards Droshkivka, where the Russians are now closer to Droshkivka than they are to Pokrovsk in this section of the front line, and a push to the rear of Dobropolya towards the highway connecting Kramatorsk to Dobropolya. This will limit the supplies going to the Dobropolya section of the front line and threaten the positions of the Ukrainians along the second highway. Where, again, if we take a look at the fortifications map, we can see that the Russians, with their foothold within Sofiivka, can push further north towards Pavlivka, Priut, and Tursk, bypassing the defensive line to the east by attacking this northern section from its rear. It will also allow the Russians to push up towards Reservoir without any defensive lines between them and completely bypassing the defensive line north of Rodinsk. This will allow the Russians to push up towards the next line of defense. However, the second highway between Kramatorsk and Dobropolya has another defensive line, which is multi-layered, anti-tank ditches, track lines, and barbed wire, all defending against a breakthrough by the Russian forces from this first line to the second line of defense here in the rear of the Donetsk region. Instead, the Russians will look to regain control over the areas they previously captured and then push onwards towards Sochi, Kvilitzk, Ruske, and Vesele, as they previously have gained positions around. And this also shows why the Russians pushed in that direction once they got the breakthrough, that is to push through these fortifications and defensive lines the Ukrainians had prepared. To the east of this, the Russians managed to gain control over some positions here along the Bilitzk Reservoir, where they pushed to the southwest of Lishivka along the defensive lines to connect their forces between the east and the west on the northern bank of the reservoir. Further north, the Russians managed to continue offensive operations towards Drobyshevo. Following a month where it's been very silent in this section of the front line, the Russians restarted their push into the town, where they're looking to gain control of it to cut off the northern flank leading into Leman from the northwestern direction, including the supply lines going through Yarova, all the way through to Drobyshevo and then into the city itself from the northwestern direction, which is already being under threat by the Russian forces operating within Yarova, Novoselivka, and Derilove. Finally, there was a push by the Russians in the direction of Petropavlivka, here in the northern flank of the town. The Russians managed to reach the outskirts of the town. Whether they managed to gain a foothold or not is not clear. What we do see is that the Ukrainians continue the defense of the northern flank. The Russians are here looking to expand the supply lines heading into the eastern parts of Kopansk, gain control over Petropavlivka, and thereby the highway that connects from Zatyshok in the east to Kopansk in the west, for the main highway to be under their control, and then to push through these defensive lines and the positions along the Usk River line to encircle what remains of Ukrainian forces east of the Usk River line, and to gain full control over this eastern flank of Kupiansk for further offensive operations both to the west and south along the Usk River line and towards the city of Kharkiv itself. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue their offensive operations towards Volyepole, gain control over the northeastern farm area, where they've managed to gain a foothold within the northern parts, where they're looking to outflank the fortifications on the northern outskirts of Volyepole. Russians already have gained control over the eastern farm areas, as well as the fortifications on the eastern flank. This allows for the Russian forces to push into the main residential area north of the river line. A push through from the eastern flank to gain control of the fortifications will open the road for Russian forces to enter from the northern parts and then into Volyepole north of the Haichu River. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.